and share screen. Do that one, right?
It's this one.
Right.
Yes. There you go. I'm trying to get it out of
No.
this mode that we're in. Oh, before I kill myself. And anyway, this is the mode it's in, and we're
I don't mind it being in that mode. I mean, they're not going to see.
it's the, in fact, it's the recording
Oh.
that shows it like this, and I'm trying to get away from that.
Uh-oh. I'm sorry. No, I missed it.
That's okay. Let's see, and maybe it's down here somewhere. Sorry, sorry, folks.
Would this do it? No.
Mm-mm.
How about that?
Mm-mm.
Uh-uh.
How about this one? Is that? All right, well, I'll tell you what, we'll just go with it. I'm going to have to advance it because when we did our test runs on this, it didn't work, the advancement. So
Okay.
without further ado,
All right, Bert, thank you.
just don't trip over everything.
I'll try not to because I tend to move around a bit, but I'll try to stay in this general area. I've got a laser pointer to help me.
Okay.
All right. Oh, and the lights are out. That's nice. Okay. Yes, thanks for coming tonight. And a little background about myself. I actually am from Phoenix. I was born and raised here in the Salt River Valley, and now live in Tucson. But I've been working with archaeologists for almost 40 years now. But I have to forewarn you that I am basically a dirt guy, a geologist that likes soils and stratigraphy and dirt. So tonight, I'm afraid you're going to be seeing more pictures of dirt than you are nice artifacts. So I'm just giving you a heads up now. But I've been lucky enough over the years to have worked with some great people, and I've done different types of where you combine geology and archaeology. The term geoarchaeology is we often use. So I'm a geoarchaeologist. I've been fortunate enough to do all different applications of my specialty to archaeology, and one of them is looking at ancient water control here in the Southwest in particular. So back in the 1980s, I was between my master's and my PhD, and I started working for a CRM firm, cultural resource management firm. We were just there were a lot of freeways at that time, and we were put a freeway through the city where hitting these Hoboken canals. And so that's how I kind of got into this, and then sort of continuing with it over the decades. So this map up here is the famous one. In fact, I think it is in your archaeology room. This is by Omar Turney, who was an engineer for the city, but he was also an avocational archaeologist. And he mapped a lot of sites and canals in the lower Salt River Valley, and this is his famous map. So when most people think about prehistoric canals in Arizona, they automatically think of these Hoboken canals. But what I want to stress tonight is that the history of managing water through canals and reservoirs and things of that sort is goes much farther back in time than the Hoboken, right? So Hoboken, AD 400 to 1450 years, around that range. As Marie said, we're going to be going back farther in time before pottery and what we used to call the late Archaic, but now we're kind of redefining as early agricultural period because they were farming. I mean, a lot of this water control was for growing crops. And next, please. So my objectives tonight, kind of give you an overview of some of this early water management, and then also working our way up to the Hoboken and more recent evidence. And then emphasize really just how the diversity of strategies that we see in terms of trying to divert, capture, and store water on the landscape. These indigenous peoples really knew hydrology and they knew the environment, and so they were quite ingenious in how they were able to utilize this precious resource of water. And of course, since water is the limiting resource in dry lands, it influenced where people lived across the landscape. So we'll talk about how, settlements and subsistence patterns were influenced by this water management. And at the end, I'll just touch briefly on why I think, this type of research is important, not just for kind of understanding cultural history, environmental history, but also I think it provides perspective to some of the challenges we face today with growing population, climate change, and water availability issues. Next, please. All right, most of you probably have a general understanding of the cultural chronology of Arizona, and my talk today really focuses mainly on central and southern Arizona, Sonoran Desert area. But let me just kind of go through this quickly, just to refresh. So we got people, well, conventional wisdom is, first people about 13,000 years ago, Clovis. Recently, you've probably seen or heard about these footprints in the White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. The chronometry looks really darn good, and they're human footprints, there's no doubt about it. And they date apparently 21,000 years before present, during the peak of the last glacial maximum. So it's really intriguing, but we don't really have any material culture. The artifacts kind of go with some of this early evidence. So we're still trying to wrap our heads around what that is. But in terms of like one of the earliest archaeologically defined cultures, that we can definitely turn to like Clovis, Paleo-Indian, back at the end of the last ice age. These were big game hunters, of course, with their lancelet fluted points, hunting mammoth and mastodon and camel. About 70% of that megafauna went extinct during Clovis time, and we still are debating how much of that was due to overhunting and how much of it was due to climate change. If we have those if humans have been around since 21,000 years ago, it may be harder to invoke overkill as a reason for the extinction, because humans have overlapped with these megafauna for some time. But again, we're still trying to figure that out. Large animals, a lot of the megafauna went extinct. People continue to be hunters and gatherers, focusing a lot on plant materials and small game. And this period, the Archaic, 7,000 years where people are foragers, small groups living across the landscape. The material culture in southern Arizona doesn't look that different from that in northern Arizona or New Mexico this time. It's archaic, groundstone, and projectile points and things of that sort. But something big happens about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, right? Particularly in southern Arizona, and that is we start to see the first evidence of domesticated crops coming up from Mexico, particularly maize, corn. Okay. And so that's a big game changer, because now people can grow food as well as forage for it. And people didn't just all of a sudden stop foraging and become full-time farmers. It was a gradual process, but nonetheless, it was a very important hinge point in history in terms of how people subsisted and interacted with the environment. So we have maize in Arizona as early as 2100 BC. Actually, some of it even earlier, but about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, we start to see maize. And then the other big development was about AD 200 or so. We see the development of well-fired ceramics, which you think, well, why is that a big change? That was actually very important in terms of like food storage, for example, and then also led to exchange and trade. And so after about 8200, we start to move into this period called the formative, where we really see a lot of regional differentiation in material culture. And so we come up with these archaeologically defined cultural groups like Hohokam, like Mogollon, like Sinawa or Mimbres. So that was, and much of what I'll talk about in terms of Hohokam, you can see AD 450 to 1450. At that point, you've got 3,000 years of agriculture at least. So a long history of growing food. And then by the time of the Spanish Entrada in the 1500s, we see the ethno-historic groups, modern groups today, O'Dam, Pipash, Yavapai, Apache, and of course we know the story of the depredations they faced with Euro-American contact. Many are still recovering from that event, but many also are increasingly demonstrating their cultural identity and sovereignty in this nation. Okay, that's a quick rundown of cultural history. Next, please.
Oh, what happened?
No, there we go. So farming comes in, again, about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And that's a big change because now you're having to invest time into planting, and then harvesting that food. You don't move as far away from it. You can still be somewhat mobile, but you're tethered a little bit more in space when you start planting crops. So it affects mobility, or say people become more sedentary. It increases the amount of food that one has, and that eventually leads to population, in particular when water becomes involved here, right? Because so with maize, that's a tropical domesticate from Mesoamerica. Generally, you need to have irrigation or some sort of water conserving strategy to grow maize. And so it wasn't, I mean, we soon find that in the early days, in the early stages of the ag, probably floodwater farming, utilizing natural, where the water is shallow to the surface. But eventually they started diverting water, started manipulating the water and modifying the hydrology. That requires more labor and more organization. So the introduction of crops and then the beginning of water control all kind of work together to like increase population, increase more social organization and maybe differentiation within communities, and particularly the ecological footprint increases because now you are playing a role in where water and sediment moves on the landscape and vegetation, and you're living in one place for longer periods of time. So you're going to be harvesting wood, and you're going to be changing the biogeography. So agriculture, and then particularly water management, really changed the relationship humans have with the environment, and that the results of that are left in the landscape still today. There are legacies of this cultural change in terms of soils and these buried canals under our feet. Next, please. So, where are the earliest canals in the Southwest? Right, thus far, we find them in the Tucson area, and they're probably in other floodplains that have deposits of the right age, but we are finding these canals deeply buried in like the Santa Cruz River floodplain. And this is a picture of one here that we have charcoal that we were able to radiocarbon date about 1540 to 1430 BC. So many of you are looking at that and you're going to ask yourselves, how does he know that's a canal? Right? As you know, by the way, these features are really defined by stratigraphy and dirt. That's why you got a geoarchaeologist at the site looking at this stuff, because that's pretty much what it is. And so the challenge is, how does one distinguish that from a natural channel? Well, in this case, we were fortunate because that'd be nice when that sun comes down.
Oh, yeah.
Come on in. Come on in. Yeah, no problem. In this case, this was in Tucson, and the sands within this channel were of a different mineralogy from all the surrounding deposits around it. And what it ended up being is water was diverted from the Santa Cruz River onto the side slope, alluvial fan on the side, along an unnatural alignment. So water was brought up along a lesser slope, and water does not naturally do that. So the mineralogy that was in the fill told me this is something different, and then we're able to reconstruct it, that it was definitely created by humans rather than being just a natural channel. It can be challenging if you only have one exposure, and some of these are very deep, as you can see. If you have one exposure, you got this little sandy channel, you might not, it may be impossible to know if it's cultural or natural. Sometimes you can look at the pollen in there, and you might have maize pollen, corn pollen, but a natural channel growing by a cornfield might have maize pollen in it too. So often, if it's just one exposure, it can be equivocal. But if you have multiple lines of evidence, it helps. But this one was a particular location. Where
Can I see that, please?
Yes.
Just take it off. It's not working.
Oh no.
I know, you can hear him, but it's not coming here so the Zoom people can.
Am I moving too far away from it?
No, I think the battery went out on it.
Oh,
Is that the caliche level we saw that was cut into in that last slide?
let's go back. Oh, I can't do that. Marie does that. She's going forward. Let's go backwards. There we go. Right there. Yeah, good eye, good eye. There is some carbonate in this. But I think most of this lighter color and up here is silt rather than carbonate. In terms of like caliche, really well cemented carbonate layers, these deposits are too young for that. But good eye. I mean, yeah, I mean, that makes it stand out right there. And like I said, if I throw acid on it, it'll fizz, but it's not like really well developed carbonate. Most of that light color, I think, is silt.
Caliche will hold water longer.
It certainly can, but the caliche does, of course, it fills the pore space within the soil, right? And so there's less volume to hold that water. So it can be actually served as an aquafluid depending on how cemented the caliche is, right? Water works its way down, hits that caliche, and it'll perch right above it. But in this case, it's not too strongly developed. Marie, let me know when you want me to proceed.
Oh, I can do that right now.
Oh, okay, so you want me to continue?
Yes.
Okay,
please.
without that.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna.
Go without it because I got a feeling this is.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm sorry for those
Yeah.
who are attending through Zoom. Can we go forward? I think you went backwards.
Oh, okay. That's weird.
Here you go. Yeah, okay, there we are. Let's stop right there.
Got it. Got it.
So here's another example.
You gotta
right?
fix
I told you
that,
lots
guys.
of pictures of dirt here. So what we have here is a canal that was used and then filled with flood sand. A flood came in and filled it. They came in later and dug another channel like right next to it, you know, and say, well, rather than just dig this out, we're gonna dig another one, kind of follow the alignment a little bit. And then a big flood hit it, filled it with sand, and then it was forgotten. And then eventually, 1,000 years later, the Hokum come in and happen to build a house right on top of it. Next slide, Marie.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. So just by chance, a serendipity, right? So this, we have charcoal out of this 800 BC, 700 BC. Actually, we use a couple different dating methods. I won't go into the details, but regular carbon and then this method called luminescence. And then, yeah, a house floor right on top. So sometimes, yeah, you get lucky like that. So this is kind of what we're looking at. These funny looking, look like natural channels, and natural channels can look like this, but we actually will find, we actually traced this out and could see it did not follow the normal path of a natural stream. Next, please. All right, so for a long time, we're able to identify the canals themselves, but a big part of the irrigation system we were missing. That's the fields, where the water goes to, where the crops are grown. And we were digging trenches and trenches, and we'd look at the walls of the trench in the stratigraphy, and it just don't see it. And then about 20 years ago, archaeologists and skilled backhoe operators started to dig down and strip horizontally. And so they were getting a plan view shot of it. And this is an example of doing that. And what we're seeing all of a sudden is this polygonal patterning in the soil. And you're seeing that here. They actually use spray paint to sort of outline the berms. These are field cells that are very deep below the surface. Here's a backhoe for scale.
What did you call the field cells?
Field cells, like little cells, little enclosed polygons, bounded by little ditches and then berms.
This is the end of the ditch.
This is the end of the irrigation system. They're actually, you have an intake, you have a main canal, then it branches out, and most of the fields will be, yes, at the terminus of it, although you might actually have some a little bit higher in the system, but this is towards the terminus. This really opened our eyes because then we started finding them everywhere. This is Las Campas, dating to about 1000 BC. This next one, please. 1000. I'm sorry. That's the thing about down there in along the Santa Cruz River in Tucson. That's all floodplain deposits, and it got buried over 3,000 years.
17 or 18 feet deep.
Almost. I mean, you saw that backhoe in there. Yeah. So most archaeological testing excavations will just dig a 5 foot deep trench, right? You're not gonna see these. Yeah. So it's really, this was a project that was a water treatment plant where they really were gonna dig deep. And so they allowed us to go deeper and boom, we're finding it. Not all of these pre-ceramic, these early agricultural period canals and fields are that deep, but they're in Las Copos and many places in the Tucson area, they are deep. And so it takes quite a bit of money to actually get to them to study it. But here's what we have. We can see this sort of hierarchical branching network of channels. And then these are the field cells that we see with the canals coming in here, and then the earthen berms. These are run anywhere from like 15 to 30 feet in diameter, rectangular, irregular shape. This general pattern, this branching, distributary pattern is the template for all subsequent canals that we see going up to the whole 100,000 years. So by 1000 BC, you've got kilometer-long canal systems. Here, probably irrigating anywhere about 50. Let's see how many acres. I can't remember. It's over a kilometer long, about almost a mile long. Believed to have supported probably maybe 50 to 100 people.
So these people weren't hunter-gatherers in our BC?
Good question. They were both. They were farmers, and they obviously were investing quite a bit of energy in this, but we also recover wild game and wild plants in sort of the habitation structures that we see. So they are farmer foragers. Perhaps not too different than the historic Tohono who farmed in the summer and then, foraged in the winter. Next, please. Oh, dear.
Why do we say that the whole started at 500 AD? And it's so significant about the canal. In fact, there were people.
Did it go? Hang on just a
Yeah. Well, we define Hohokam as an archaeological term to refer to a certain culture based on not just canal, their pottery, their architecture, their burial practices. So they know that's in the formative period. But there were groups before them that were practicing canal irrigation. The Hohokam descent, they inherited that technology from their predecessors. But prior to pottery, this is before pottery. They don't have the distinctive pottery that we call them, pre-Hohokam, whatever. We just call them early agriculture.
What were they growing back then?
Lots of maize, lots of corn.
Beans?
Later we get beans and we get squash, and then a lot of weeds that grow that are endemic there that tend to grow in disturbed soils that can be eaten as well, such as amaranth or goose pigweed or there's another term for it. I can't remember. Amaranth. Here's another example, not as deeply buried, so maybe 5 feet below the surface. But this was a case, this is going back to the Reed fan site, again, in the Tucson area, where just by luck, these ancient fields were buried by, the fields were kind of in a silty, muddy kind of soil. They got buried by a fine sand so that when we came down on top, we could actually blow the sand away and get the field preserved in 3 dimensions. You can kind of see the square here, right? This is sort of a ditch and this is a field cell. This is the backhoe operator out there, like a little blowing tool, the compressor to blow off the sand. And this thing was kind of cool because you actually had human and dog footprints, or canid footprints. We don't know if it was coyote or domesticated dog. Murray, please. Yeah. So to almost 3,000-year-old human footprints, you get toes and everything else. I mean, it's pretty cool, It's not really beautiful jewelry or pottery, but it's just kind of cool to put yourself back and these people walking across this muddy field. And this was right near Tucson, maybe about 3 miles downstream from downtown Tucson.
Did it sell?
These date about 800 BC, so it's early agricultural period. Yeah.
How would that make you assume that the water or the fill came in quickly?
The fill?
Blood?
Okay, good question. We can look at the overlying sediments, and the overlying sediments were sandy versus the soil, which was silt and clay. So sand, a little bit higher water velocity. This is an area where the Rito, if you know Tucson, Rito Creek comes in and joins the Santa Cruz River. And the Rito would often is very sandy alluvium and would flood and bury these fields. So I don't know how big that flood was, but it was enough to like cover it pretty all at once. And then later they would come in and put another field on top of it. Yeah, next please. So the cool thing down there in the Santa Cruz River is that we've got this deep sequence that starts off 1500 BC. And then later you got Las Capas and San Pedro phase. This is all early agricultural there, San Pedro phase and Cienega phase. And then also we have Hohokam canals too. And they get bigger through time within, one drainage. You got to consider how much water is in the drain, in the stream, as well as, how much land they can farm. Water really limits it. Santa Cruz River is just this little stream. It never was a perennial stream. It's an intermittent stream. Some reaches were perennial and others were dry parts of the year. But what we see is we've got 3,000 years of history. We can see how they generally got bigger with time as population increased and the amount of land that was irrigated increased as well. So in Tucson, we got the oldest canals, but we don't have the biggest ones. The biggest ones are up here, Salt River Valley and Felix valleys. Next, please. Before I head up to the Phoenix area, just to say this was another interesting discovery recently. These farmers were not just irrigating the canals, but they were also harvesting runoff into reservoirs. And so this is an oblique aerial photo of the Santa Cruz River, a couple miles from downtown Tucson, looking at these hills here of the foothills of Tucson Mountains, and there are these desert washes that come out and join the Santa Cruz River. A road widening project on Silver Bell Road hit a reservoir, prehistoric reservoir. Reed, next please. Right about there.
Hang on just a minute.
There it is. Oh, right there. And
Sorry.
again, there was no surface evidence of this thing. It was we started digging these trenches, and the trench went down about 5 feet. But at the bottom of the trench hit this clay. And me being a soils guy is like, well, given where we are, this position on the landscape, there really shouldn't be a dark organic clay here. We dug deeper, and sure enough, this was a reservoir that was taking water off this wash. The water's coming down here, flashy runoff, and they must have had a channel to bring it in here because this sits above the wash here. And this is all gravity flow, right? So you have to divert the water upslope to get it in there. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what it looks like. We have all of a sudden these layers of silt and clay, and there was charcoal in it. And there was no pottery. And this was the first time. It's like, wait a sec, I've never been in a prehistoric reservoir to have pottery because it's always Hohokam. This isn't any pottery. I'm thinking I think this is pre-Hohokam. And it was. It was right, yeah. Right now, we're still trying to revise the chronology. We've got a couple different dates that are reversed in sequence, but nonetheless, it's clearly pre-ceramic, about 1200, 900 BC. Co-level with those canal systems along the Santa Cruz River. So, harvesting rainwater, as well as using canals along the river down below, utilizing different sources of water, being very, very opportunistic. This is water that only, summer monsoon, flash flood. Boom, let's capture and store. Next, please. Okay, so let's move up to the Phoenix area. And these are the largest pre-Hispanic canals north of Peru. All right. These are the famous Hohokam canals. This is a map showing many of the villages during the Classic period, of course, the latter part of the Hohokam period. But we're talking about canals, some of them over 20 miles in length, connecting many villages. As you can see here, some of these villages are far from the river, so these canals not only irrigated across, but they provided their main source of domestic water.
About how far from the river are they? Because
Well-
that looks like a long way.
That's Chandler, basically.
Oh, my
Where is
word.
Chandler. So you're a good 10, 12 miles south of the Salt River. Yeah, a lot of earth being moved. Now, not all of these were being operated at the same time, but nonetheless, many of them were working at the same time. And these villages had to interact with each other, right? Because, for example, here, Pueblo Grande would have control of the water that would come all the way out here to Las Colinas and stuff. So there was this social interaction that had to be taking place. Someone probably making decisions about water allocation, land use and things. So there's a lot of cultural implications behind canal systems of this size. During the 1200s, probably the Lower Salt River Valley had upwards to maybe 50,000 people. That's the largest population, pre-contact population in the Southwest.
Was there a Gila River system here?
But you had Kyle Woodson here a couple months ago. He could definitely give you the details on that. The Gila River has impressive canals as well, but the amount of water in the Gila is much less than the Lower Salt. So the canals down the Middle Gila are just as sophisticated as these technologically, but they're not as large. So for the Salt River, the amount of runoff in the Salt River is about 1 million acre-feet per year. In the Gila River, Middle Gila River is about 300,000, so it's about 1/3 the district. So you can support more large canals on the Lower Salt River. Yeah,
Is this Gloria herself, is this South Mountain?
that is South Mountain, right there. This is Papago, Tempe, Papago Buttes. And we are somewhere out here. Canals didn't come off the Salt River to the Queen Creek area. Why?
Too close to the heat.
Well, we can't get Gila water here either.
We got a
Why?
big mountain range. It's called a
Big mountain range.
Tan Mountain.
It's all gravitational flow, and you can't get water out of the Salt of the Gila to Queen Creek. And that's why the historic canals never came up into here, right? The big historic canals. So, and stay tuned. We're gonna talk about that. as the case of water. Okay, so pretty impressive, right? Next, please. So most of these canals were, when the Euro-American settlers came in the 1860s, 1870s, many of these were still on the surface. A lot of these canals came out of the floodplain onto these older geomorphic surfaces, older landforms, where they were still visible at the surface. And this is one of the later ones. We'll talk about this canal quite a bit. We call this one Woodbury's North. This is one of the last large Holcomb canals they built in the Lower Salt River Valley. And I'll tell you how we know that. But by 1930, when these photos were taken, over 90% of these were already plowed over. All right, so they were trying to document these as much as possible, but they were big. We actually, I'll show later here that we were able to come back to this area and do excavations and rediscover this canal at the subsurface of it. Even though they got plowed over, many of the canals were still preserved beneath the surface, at least parts of the channels. Next, please. So here's Park and Four Waters next to what we used to call Pueblo Grande, but is now Sidavaki.
You got it.
Sidavaki. A museum. And just off the east end of the North Runway at Sky Harbor Airport. These are like the last two big sections there, at least in the Phoenix proper area. And this is that one canal we saw that black and white photograph of that was taken right about here. So there's two of these canals still left. We call them Woodbury's North and South because Richard Woodbury in the 1950s actually excavated these here near Sedavaki and did an excellent sort of investigation of the deposits and the size of these canals. But they're huge. Next, please. They're huge. They can drive a truck down these. This is actually taken right there at Park of Four Waters. And so the idea that the Holcomb were able to construct such large and long canals, but we never attained a state level of society, of a political organization like you see in Mesoamerica and Peru. You go to Peru, they have bigger canals, but they had state level organizations, much larger populations, labor forces than the Holcomb. But nonetheless, these folks moved a lot of earth, not just to dig them, but to maintain them as well, because they're always filling with sediment. You got to keep digging them out. So tremendous amount of labor. Next, please. As I said, you can still, many of these canals are still in the subsurface, even though they've been plowed over. If you get a hold of some Google Earth imagery, depending on what time of the year the flights were taken or whatever, you can see this is a Holcomb canal, and there's actually these little laterals that are coming out. Next, please. I'll put arrows on so you can see.
Sorry.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you're in a tough position. You're gonna get a frick in your neck. Okay, to another one.
Did it go?
Yeah, another one.
Okay.
I think I had a couple. So advance one more time. Yeah. So.
Did it advance?
Yeah, in that, yeah, a little bit there. So, yeah, so we can still map out some of these sometimes by using historical aerial photography, or even not that old. Next, please. Here's some, photography from, Tempe area, 1960s, when they were just starting to build a lot of this residential housing in these farms and fields. You see the pattern,
Oh, yeah.
the spider web pattern? These are canals and then field laterals in between. These are hohokam. And they show up on there because the clay in the canal holds a little more moisture than the surrounding more sandy soil, and so it appears darker. And you gotta apply it just right, you know, it has to be when the field moisture conditions are just right. So you might fly that same flight a month later and see nothing. But we have quite a bit of historical aerial photography. We're able to map a lot of these canals. So next, please. So that's kind of looking at the surface, but the subsurface really is kind of stuff that I do, where I look at the deposits, the dirt. And in the 1980s, as I said, I was involved with a lot of freeway projects. This is a colleague of mine, Bruce Massey, looking at one of these large hohokam canals just downstream from Parker Four Waters. This was a Hohokam Expressway project in the late 70s. And this is basically 44th Street, so it's just on the east side of Sky Harbor Airport. But you can get an idea of, they were big also as you went down into the subsurface as well. And here the canals actually dig down into the cobbles of the Salt River.
Did you see all of Jerry Howard's work over on the
Riverview?
Riverview project? Yeah.
Funny you should say that. Next slide, please.
Oh,
There's Jerry at Riverview. Marie.
Did I
saw my
read your
slides
mind?
ahead of time.
I read his mind.
Yes. So there's my colleague Jerry Howard. He and I worked together in the 80s on a lot of these canals. This is at Riverview on Mesa. And the idea is that, you know, yeah, by digging, if you can't see them on the surface, with subsurface, you get an idea of at least part of the channels, the upper channel's gone. But you can see flood sands in there. You can kind of get an idea of the flow regime in the canal. You can use open channel equations and do back of the envelope calculations. There is imprecision because we don't know what the flow depths were exactly, but we can get a general idea of what the velocity was, discharge, and then with that, maybe play around with some estimates of how much irrigation, this land would be irrigated. So a lot you can learn by looking at that dirt in those canals. Next, please. So, yeah, so talking about excavations again, what we can learn in them. So we'll go back to Parker Four Waters. Here's Woodbury's North Canal. And we were able to hit it right in here when they were building out part of the Phoenix SkyTrain project. Peter Catch that SkyTrain there on Washington. I did work here about 15 years ago with Desertt Archaeology. Next slide, please. And we hit that canal. We actually hit several canals. This is Woodbury's North. We call it 200 or the North Canal. But there were many others in the subsurface that we didn't know about, but we kind of knew because Bruce Massey was working upstream from us in the Hohokam Expressway, hit several canals too. But anyway, we got them in here, and we have these cross-cutting relationships that we can use to relatively date them. And next slide, please. And then here's Woodbury's North. I kind of highlighted it here so you can kind of see it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to tell in that trench. But the cool thing is you look at the deposits, and there were like slow energy, water velocity canal type, typical canal deposits in the lower part, but the whole middle and upper part was dominated by high energy sands, with big chunks of clay ripped up in it. It was an uncontrolled salt river flood that basically came in there and filled it with sediment, and they never cleaned it back out. It basically ended the life of that big canal. Now, we knew it was in the classic period of the Hohokam, it was towards the latter part, but, you know, every now and then I say you get lucky. This case, we got lucky. We found, next please. We found polychrome pottery in the canal, associated with an actual structure, water feature or a head gate on this canal, which told us this was late. And it was probably, we think, in the 1300s, late 1300s, early 1400s. That's important because we still don't fully understand why the population peaked in the 1200s and then started declining, and eventually the valley was depopulated by 1450. We still don't understand the end of the Hohokam, how that happened. One hypothesis is that they were hit with a bunch of big floods on the Salt River, which damaged their irrigation networks. Now, the Hohokam had dealt with floods long before the late 1300s, early 1400s. And so we can't just invoke floods, but nonetheless, the tree rings had suggested that there were big floods occurring in the late 1300s, stressing these agricultural systems. Here, we actually get geologic evidence of a flood in a canal. All right, so we did different lines of evidence. The tree rings, now we got some geologic evidence suggests, yeah, this might not be the ultimate cause of why the system collapsed, but it definitely may have triggered it. And they never rebuilt any other large canal in this part of the valley. It's what we call System 2 after this one. This was the last big canal. So things you learn by looking at the dirt. Next, please. Okay, so these are all canals tied to perennial water on the Salt River. But here in Queen Creek, I said they were doing canal irrigation out here too, utilizing seasonal runoff. So before we go to Queen Creek, let's go up north to Cave Creek. All right, that's that red circle up there is a project I was involved with about 15 years ago, I think, as well. Next, please. So Cave Creek, even during Hohokam time, was not a perennial stream, but it probably seasonally flowed, maybe in the spring or winter during the rainy seasons. And this is a Google Earth image of Cave Creek. Here's Cave Creek Road. This is south of the Carefree Highway. What we're going to look at are some sites, one in particular, which Sonora Boulevard actually cut right through one of these sites. Next advance, please. I think we show them. Yeah. Along this reach of Cave Creek were these sites that had these light-colored silty soils that were quite curious. So we were able to actually cut through this one to see what it was all about. Next, please. What it's all about is that this was a Hohokam agricultural field system where you had a canal that was diverting water off Cave Creek and depositing silt on top of very gravelly, porous soil. Basically, they were creating arable land, and we think intentionally, all right, through irrigation. All right, so this thing is, I don't know, about 600 feet long, maybe about, no, it's about 1,000 feet long. It's about maybe 500 feet wide at its widest. And so, next slide, please. So this is what the natural soils look like. Not great soil for, growing corn, but this is what the human modified soil is, where, these silt fields are, where they're capturing silt and increasing water holding capacity, nutrient exchange capacity, making it much more fertile and arable. We know this because we actually identified a canal coming into it on the north side, and we also identified stone alignments within it. Next, please. And we think what was going on is that they were using stone alignments, probably vegetation as well. This is a living fence row from northern Mexico, where farmers are actually planting trees and putting brush in there to try to slow down the floodwaters and drop that nutrient-rich sediment to help fertilize the soil and help maintain sustainable farming. So of course, when we come 1,000 years later, we just have these rock alignments, right? But we think that they were probably using something similar to this ethnographic example from northern Mexico. So these are these legacies, agricultural legacies that still are on the landscape over 1,000 years later that they created. That is one of the things that kind of makes Arizona cool. These signatures in the landscape from this ancient farming. Next, please. Okay, so let's get to Southeast Phoenix Basin. So this is a geologic map. Florence Junction here, Superstition Mountains. Here's Queen Creek. So this is a geologic map of the basin fill, not of the hard rock. So I'm a soft rocker. I do the dirt. So this is when I was in the 90s working on my dissertation and working at the Arizona Geological Survey. I did a lot of mapping out here of these alluvial fans. And this is a very dynamic area geomorphically. I really like the Queen Creek area because it's much more geomorphically dynamic than other parts of the Phoenix Basin, mainly because of Queen Creek. You've got this water course that starts up in the Central Highlands above Superior and then comes out of the Superstitions. And then it was never a perennial stream in Hohokam time, but boy, did it flood. And it flooded historically. Several of you know the stories about the floods that we had here historically, and could have again. And so up here in the upper part, what we call this Piedmont, this broadly sloping surface, the streams are largely contained. They're incised and they flow between terraces. But as they come out into the broader part of the basin, the streams become unconfined and then fan out. And this sort of dotted area here, we call the Queen Creek fan. Some of the early geologists called it the delta, which is a misnomer, but it's the Queen Creek fan because this is where water goes from channelized flow to sheet floods over broad areas, sometimes then coming back into a channel, being channelized, but then fanning out again. And you had channels shifting laterally back and forth. And for infrastructure, very problematic. That's why they eventually put in the dam up here above Florence Junction. Say Whitlow, is that right?
Whitlow.
Yeah, Whitlow Dam. But on the other hand, there was water on the landscape. It was pretty unpredictable, but it was nonetheless periodically on the landscape, and the Hohokam took advantage of that. So this is really kind of rainfall harvesting in a way, taking advantage of seasonal water that was coming out onto the eastern part of the basin. Now, some of the canal systems here were pretty impressive. We'll start off with these on Queen Creek. This is about 8 miles upstream. Next, please.
Oh,
Yeah, okay, one more. There we go. 8 miles upstream, about where the CAP aqueduct comes through across. And this was work done in the 70s and 80s by the Arizona State Museum as part of the CAP construction. And right there at Queen Creek, we have large villages. This is a Hohokam village called Frogtown. And there were several canals, 2-3 miles long. These all just capitalized on periodic flows and floods that would come down Queen Creek. And then they would bring it out into fields or into reservoirs. So here's the site of Frogtown. This upper circle, this is a canal that was dug back at that time. A lot of this work was done by a guy named Al Dart. Some of you may know. He's a founder director of Old Pueblo Archaeology. This is a canal 10 feet wide, 4 feet down. I had a chance to come out here to the lower part of this about 20 years ago. Mike, does that sound familiar? No. Yeah. And we just got the tail end of it here. But what's interesting is you could still see it. You see this sort of like light colored, that kind of a berm, there's creosote growing inside it. That's the canal. That's what you see. You can still see the traces of these on the surface because they haven't been plowed over by ag or houses yet. But nonetheless, you can still trace out some of these. And we had a chance to kind of look at this one, and there's a nice sandy channel in there. Next, please, Mike. That you can see here, a nice sandy flow. So not clay, but like, periodic floods coming down Queen Creek, channel down these things, and then this is towards the terminus where the fields probably go. So pretty impressive. My colleague, geographer Bill Doolittle, who specializes in ancient agriculture, he calls this the largest rainfall harvesting system in North America. Ancient rainfall harvesting system in North America. Right on Queen Creek. There you go. So yeah, not as big as some of the ones in the suburb. You wouldn't expect it to be, but nonetheless, no less impressive in terms of engineering. Next, please. Okay, going back to this map, water storage. Okay, so there are these canals, and some of them fed into water storage devices. This is another one up on the upper Piedmont we'll look at first, and then we'll take another one over here out on the fan, the Queen Creek fan down low. Next, please. So that one up there, 9A, here it is. This is, we call it a catchment basin. Well, what's the difference between a catchment basin and a reservoir? It's a matter of semantics, but we tend to consider reservoirs as being fed by a canal, whereas a catchment basin is digging a large depression in the path of a natural channel to capture that water. All right. And here you had, we were able to date this about AD 1200, classic period. Wash would bring water in. We think of this inlet. We had a feature that's about 36 feet wide, 23 wide, 7 foot deep, and filled with kind of sand, silt, and clay. So again, harvesting rainfall runoff, probably during the summer monsoon, and providing a local supply of water. Now, this was not used to irrigate crops. pumps. This is probably used for short-term domestic use. And these types of small water storage features were important for supporting these seasonal settlements. These were not year-round settlements, at least in this case, but they would come into this area maybe during the summer to do floodwater farming. Okay, so to be here during the summer, wouldn't it be nice to have a nice little source of water right there? And so we get, there are a lot of these out there in landscape, but there's no way you'd see it on the surface. They're all filled in and flat, and we haven't hit that by trenching. Next, please.
Oops, wrong side.
Okay, this is that one that's lower down, 5. This actually was discovered as part of the realignment of Rittenhouse Road, where it hits Power Road. There should be a Home Depot there. Rittenhouse and Power. So they're realigning Rittenhouse Road, and there's a Home site there, Southwest Vermont site, if I'm pronouncing that right. That's one of the early ranchers, I believe, in the area, family. Hit a water storage feature that had a intake, a channel coming in and going out. These were not natural channels, these were canals. So this is a reservoir. And the fill was these nice silt and clay couplets. These just real nice layer cake, fine textured sediments. That was most of the fill. This was only about, I think maybe 10 feet. Can't remember the dimensions. It wasn't that large. I think maybe 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, maybe about 5 feet deep. Again, sort of a small temporary storage, but nonetheless, water would come in. This is actually one of the canals coming in. You can kind of tell by the textural difference on the surface. But it had this real low energy pond deposit. And I'm thinking, wait a second, we're out here on that Coon Creek fan. Water that flows out here tends to be high energy, flash flooding. How is it that they were able to get just silt and clay in here? And I hypothesized, I don't know, because I have to be somewhat conjectural here, but that they actually captured the water in some sort of large basin upslope and then slowly let it overflow into a series of ditches into this, and then subsequently down the landscape. So again, you would not know it at the surface, no depression there, just creosote growing on top of it, but when we got trenches to it, boom, we hit these interesting deposits, and it's a water storage deposit.
Question.
Pardon me?
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
For people that had such a long time experience and mastery of water in that, do they have like regular ways or routes that it would seem unusual to me at least that they could just haphazardly just go to the river and dip in and drink and bathe, whatever. And also as the water would go progressively further out in the canals, unless it was collecting more sediment, would be gravitationally deposited so that the water would be clear the further it went away too, which might be better for drinking and other things. So did you find is there any evidence or anything about such a, because after a long time of use, 1,000 years of that use, you would have patterns here as well.
You have patterns with what?
Patterns in terms of, how they got their, say, drinking water. They have.
Yeah, I mean,
for drinking water.
it's hard to demonstrate that archaeologically.
Yeah.
The fact here in Queen Creek, they're not digging springs because water tables were 30 feet down, even in Holcomb time. Water tables, they could not access the water table. So the only water they would have up here would be water that they could harvest out in the flats during the rainy season or springs up in the sand. Okay, so now in this case, that's the source of water. Getting back to the Holcomb Canal, the Salt River, we assume that like at Sadavaki and those villages near the river, they had their choice. They can go to the river, they go to the canals. But those that are farther down, they were probably drinking out of the canals. It's hard to demonstrate that, but it's just, otherwise they'd really have to walk far. I think the World Health Organization considers in developing countries, if you have to walk more than 3 kilometers for water, you are water stressed. And many of these villages are indeed more than 3 kilometers from the Salt River. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
It's like the Salt River, would have been real silty, like Colorado River, right?
Yeah.
Too thick to drink, too thin. to
But and in these reservoirs, that stuff would settle out. You're right, and so it would be a little bit more palatable than maybe just going to the river channel when it's very turgid and turbulent. You get your minerals that way. A little salt. Next, please. And then let's go to Pozos de Sanoki or Sanoki Pueblo. All right. So this was a project, that was, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe, where Riggs Road was extended beyond Ellsworth to the east. And there's a big prize. I just drove by it. And that's like the biggest prize grocery store I've ever seen. But there's a large Hohokam site there. And it's just a geomorphic context here. We're on sort of the Piedmont of the Santan Mountains where it interfaces with Sanoke Wash. Sanoke Wash is coming, kind of drains the Santan to the east and then wraps around to the north. Then you got the Queen Creek coming in. So it's really a place where both Sanoke and Queen Creek merge right in here. Queen Creek, much larger, floods more regularly, but nonetheless, Sanoke Wash would flood now and then. And so they're kind of like right there where where they kind of come together. Okay, so next, please. Am I doing time? Oh, I better wrap this up. So, for a long time, the site was covered with artifacts, definitely Hohokam site, but there was this funny looking mound. Here's a photograph from 1949, U-shaped. It was so large that it actually shows up on USGS topo maps using this contour interval. And the hypothesis was, here's that cattle tank. I think we're talking about that cattle tank, a reservoir right next to it. So, the question is it a reservoir or is it a ball court? The Hohokam built ball courts in pre-Plastic period. And so we really weren't sure until the opportunity about 10, 15 years ago to actually put a trench in on that. And guess what it was? Next week. It was a reservoir. And it was big. It was 25 feet deep. It held over 300,000 gallons when it was first constructed. Such a, this is, I actually don't see that, so, okay, good. This is so large and deep that it would not evaporate during the year, right? It's like the can rate of evaporation at about 8 feet per year. So this thing, plus it's probably getting refilled during the summer, but anyway, this held water year round and was very essential to allowing this settlement. This was a year-round permanent settlement to be there because it had a dependable water source. But that water had to be harvested. And it was harvested by capturing runoff and running it through a canal. So it's what we call a reservoir. It's fed by a canal. We're able to trace it out with trenches. We don't know how much of it was runoff from washes on the North Piedmont of Santan Mountains and how much of it was maybe some diverted from Sanoke. Maybe both. But nonetheless, it captured seasonal runoff and stored it. And this is the largest Hohokam reservoir that I know of. Frogtown it's a little bit bigger than one at Frogtown, so it's big. So then the question is, how old is it? And we didn't really get any good charcoal in there today, but yeah, every now and then you get lucky. And on this one, a very late Hohokam, Los Muertos polychrome. I don't know pottery, but Los Muertos polychrome, which didn't get started until 1390. Like at the very end of the Hohokam period. At the very bottom of the reservoir. Oh, at the very bottom. So if it was up at the top, it's like, well, I don't know how long did it take to fill it to get right when they dug this thing right at the very end of the Hohokam period, which is really quite interesting. You know.
The picture, this site right there is, are you saying this is like South Summit and Channel Heights? Where that?
This here is Riggs Road.
Riggs Road.
That's Riggs Road, and Ellsworth would be somewhere over here, running north-south.
East of Florence.
So, okay, and when did this happen? When was that date?
2010?
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Wow.
2012?
Orchard right there too.
The time I was there, it was just fields, cotton fields to the north and houses to the south.
This is in the river.
No, this is not in the river. This is on. I didn't see any high school there, so.
The district,
Oh. There you go.
there's a reason why there's no question where it is, because the school district could have gotten that land very cheap, but they knew they'd hit a lot of skeletons. And so they moved all the way down by Schnepp Farms because they were afraid to get the bones.
Huh. And there are a lot of probably inhumations or burials here. 'cause it's
Probably a
large
wise decision.
A classic period site here.
Yes, and part of the first excavations by Jacob, they did kind of fudge and go onto the farm property a little. Sorry.
Until Martin said-
Doesn't
We
matter.
just- we
They
just-
were talking about it.
We just kind of probed a little bit, because we wanted to see what the fill, the dirt looked like. Is it a vocal, is it a reservoir? That does not lie. That is definitely pond reservoir deposits. So a very cool discovery. And again, we kind of knew it was there because it had a topographic expression, because it's large. And it was bulldozed sometime in the 70s. So, you know, we kind of knew from aerial photography and mapping where it's going to be, so we could probe down there and dig it. And of course, due to safety issues, you really got to pull out a lot of earth to kind of get down to the bottom of it. So yeah, water harvesting. Next, please. I'm out of time. Got it. Okay, here's a little cartoon where I kind of, you know, being a geomorphologist, kind of showing what does this look like on a landscape scale. We've got seasonal runoff coming out of the Superstition Mountains in the Piedmont. Once it comes out of where it's constrained, you can dig canals. This is like up there near Frogtown. Canals coming off these washes, but these natural channels, actually, they become fans, channel fans. Water spreads out. They would take advantage of where that water spread out, perhaps harvest some of that water, and then take it through a canal into another smaller reservoir. Here's Sanoki. Here we think what's going on, water coming off of either both the wash or up to the Piedmont. So these folks really had understanding of hydrology, geomorphology, climate, the whole bit, to take advantage of an area where not, you have to say it's pretty marginal for farming, but they were able to farm, and they were able to, in some cases, live out there in permanent settlements because of their ability to harvest water. Next, please.
Computer's getting fussy.
Okay, we're almost done. So I'll speed through this. So yeah, main point, I want to drive home. We've got 3,000 years of water management here in Arizona, where people are utilizing water as it occurs in different places, different environments. And it played an important role in sort of the deep agricultural history of this and cultural history of Arizona. As I said, agriculture goes back 4,000 years. But a big part of that, for most of that time, they were irrigating with some sort of canals and similar types of floodwater farming strategies. Next, please. So that tells us a lot about the Hohokam and their predecessors. Anything we might gain, consider with today, where we have an increasing population in the Southwest. We've got 50 million people, but dependent on the lower Colorado River, and we now realize it's over allocated, and we don't know how it's going to be impacted by future climate change. And is there anything that any lessons to be learned from looking at the Hohokam and their predecessors? I'm not going to sit here and say, all I'm going to do is scale up the size of these floodwater fields and it will be fine. No, we're talking 50 million people, and you just can't scale these up. But nonetheless, there are some lessons. Water remains a limiting resource in these dry lands. Next, please. One of the lessons, I think, is definitely take advantage of water where it occurs on the landscape. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Utilize some of the seasonal or ephemeral sources of water. And we are seeing that with many communities. Many municipalities are increasingly turning to, for example, rainwater, whether it's harvesting, runoff from your roof or in your yard. City of Tucson City Water actually pays people to help sort of harvest some of their runoff on their property. At least to help subsidize developing some of these catchments. And so we see cities and communities building large catchment basins to sort of capture some of that runoff so that water can go into the ground and recharge water tables, actually restore some riparian habitats as well. We can't use just this to irrigate all the crops in the Southwest, but nonetheless, it does allow us a little more resilience. We don't have to be so dependent on the Colorado River. Next, please.
No, not working.
There we go. The other idea is when we're talking about water use in the state, of course, we have to talk about agriculture. And because, California and Arizona, 75, 80% of the water use is in ag. And we're going to have to rethink really the types of foods that we grow. Are should we really be growing, I don't know, pecans in Arizona, for example? Well, I mean, there are certain domesticated crops and indigenous domesticated crops that are very drought tolerant, like peppery beans, for example. You can actually flood water farm those peppery beans. We're not going to be able to scale that up, and it's the scale of corn and wheat and rice, but nonetheless, there are certain crops that are better adapted to these types of traditional irrigation systems than what we have today. And there are also the natural foods as well. The desert that could be an alternative food source, such as mesquite, sorrel fruit as well, which we find at these holocaunt sites. They were still foraging. They were mixing farming and foraging. Maybe we should forage a little more ourselves. Next, please. All right. Yeah, I'm out of time. So let me just wrap this up. 3,500 years, sophisticated infrastructure, managing water. It's quite impressive. And I don't think you're going to find anything like it anywhere else in the North America, certainly north of Mexico. This changed human ecological relationships because of how people were placing themselves in the landscape, more sedentary, more resource intensive, altering the flow of water, sediment, energy. So these things are still on the landscape. They just have to be identified. And in many cases, they lie beneath the city still today. And I think it provides some context for what we're going through today. Look at just the Holcomb by themselves for about 1,000 years of sustainable agriculture, which is quite impressive. They didn't reach population levels we have today, but nonetheless, they did support large communities for long periods of time. So there's something to be said about resilience and sustainability. Nonetheless, having said that, we still can't figure out why in the 1300s and 1400s the population declined and then eventually the valley was depopulated. And that gives us pause, of why that was. Can't give you the answer to that tonight. I'm still trying to work on that. It wasn't because they ran out of water. Other things were going on, but definitely the long history they have, a big part of that success was their ability to manage water. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I ran a little late.
That's-
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you been involved in any?
I gotta get out.
Developments from the Gila River?
I did my dissertation on the Gila River, Middle Gila River, Florence down into the Gila River community. Yeah, there's some really some impressive canals down there. Canal Grande. You can still see some of the sections on the surface of Canal Grande, Casa Grande Canal. But my colleague Kyle Woodson did his dissertation on those Gila River canals, and he gave a talk here 2 months ago. He's one of the directors at Gila River Institute. So I have worked on canals in Gila River, but not as much as Kyle. He's the expert.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and there's always excavations going on now because the Phoenix metropolitan area continues to grow. I passed more than a few housing developments being constructed on as I drove out today. So not all of them require archaeological clearance, but many of them do for various reasons because of antiquity laws. So every now and then keep your eye open because every now and then there will be a dig or something where they open up to the public and you can see. I have to admit they don't do that as much as they used to because of sensitivity issues with Native Americans. But every now and then, like when those footprints down in Tucson, we opened that up to the public. Boy, we had a big turnout for that. It was really cool.
There was footprints in Tempe.
Yes, yeah. I didn't get to see those, but I heard about that. Did they do an open house so people could see?
I think they did.
Yeah,
Carol? Oh, she's not here.
but most,
He
so,
went over and looked at it.
but there's, like this year, I'm sure I'll probably do 3 or 4 digs in the Phoenix area alone that will have canals. It's just because they're everywhere. And sometimes they're subtle, but that's why they hire a geoarchaeologist to come out and say, is this a canal? Yeah. Okay, Picacho Reservoir, we don't have any evidence of there being a reservoir there prehistorically, but just upslope on the Piedmont of the Picacho Mountain, There's a very well-known Holcomb reservoir there, a catchment basin, big one, that was studied by ASM 30 years ago. I did not get a chance to look at that, but right where the historic Picacho Reservoir is, I don't know, could be, but up on the Piedmont above it, like maybe a mile away, there's a Holcomb.
River canals are heading almost right towards the coast.
Yeah, the Holcomb ones or the historic ones? Yeah, the historic ones go that way because that's part of the San Carlos irrigation system. And CAP is up higher on the Piedmont. That Holcomb Reservoir is between the CAP and Picacho Reservoir, but Picacho Reservoir is part of the San Carlos irrigation district. And then the CAP, of course, is where we get our water in Tucson. So yeah, there are water storage features in the Picacho Basin, but I don't know if there are any underneath where that historic was. Yeah.
So you, like many other archaeologists, talk about the great cooperation between all the whole time. And yet, around 1,000 AD, they went from living little villages in circle to forts, to fortified villages, 16-foot wall.
Yeah.
Who are they fortifying?
No, there's no doubt. I do not believe for an instant there was not a conflict.
Are they fortifying against each other? Or are they fortifying against the Apache?
It doesn't have to be Apache. We had other groups coming down before the Apache from the north. That first rated plate is the museum is all about. That's from somewhere from the Cayenne area, the Four Corners. In fact, Posos de Sanoki, we think that could have been one of those groups coming from the north at the very end. So you don't have to have the Athabascan group coming in. Actually, before that, you had people coming in, but they could have been conflict. You know, their defensive sites up there on Perry Mesa to the north. There was a lot going on in the time period. There's definitely conflict. There's definitely violence. That's beyond my area of expertise, but there was both cooperation and conflict. Kind of sounds like today. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What's your take on the salinity situation and over time and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think that if salinity, I think they had to deal with soil salinity in a way of working with, because that is a problem that would have presented itself pretty early on when you started irrigating. If you start along certain parts of the floodplain where the water table is shallow, you over irrigate, that water's gonna come up and you're gonna get salinized soil. So in Tempe, in that area, historically, you had a lot of alkaline soils that had to fall out of production because they were in bad shape. Well, what did they do? Basically, the water tables went down, they came back and flushed them, they